Sir, you can't stay here if you're not ordering. The words landed louder than they needed to, sharp enough to turn heads across the warm, low-lit restaurant where soft jazz had been playing just seconds before. Caleb Dawson didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked down at the small hand wrapped around his, the only thing in his world that still felt steady. "It's okay," he said quietly, more to her than to anyone else, his voice calm like a man who had already run out of reasons to fight. Across the room, a few people exchanged glances, some curious, some amused, others pretending not to notice as the manager crossed his arms and waited, impatient, certain. "We have paying customers," the man added, louder this time, like he needed the room to agree with him. Caleb nodded once. "I understand." 3 words. No anger. No pride left to defend. Just quiet acceptance. The kind that doesn't ask for sympathy. The kind that carries dignity even when everything else is gone. Beside him, Mia looked up, her eyes searching his face, not for answers, but for reassurance. "Daddy, I'm not that hungry," she whispered, though the way her fingers tightened around his sleeve said otherwise. Caleb forced a small smile, the kind that held together just long enough to protect someone else. "We'll find something, okay?" The restaurant lights hummed softly above them, casting a golden glow over polished tables and untouched plates, the scent of grilled steak and butter hanging in the air like something distant, unreachable. For a moment, time slowed. The laughter from another table, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversations, it all continued, untouched, as if this moment didn't matter. As if he didn't matter. The manager exhaled sharply. "Sir." 1 word this time. "Enough." Caleb gave a slight nod, then gently guided Mia toward the door. No scene, no resistance, just movement. Quiet, controlled, dignified. The door opened with a soft chime, and the cool night air slipped in, brushing against their faces as they stepped outside. The city lights flickered across the sidewalk, neon reflections dancing in puddles from an earlier drizzle. Caleb paused for half a second, just enough to steady himself, then kept walking. Behind them, the door closed. The music resumed. The room forgot. But something had already begun to shift. Because just hours earlier, without knowing it, without asking a name or expecting anything in return, Caleb Dawson had made a choice. A small one. A quiet one. The kind the world rarely notices. And somewhere inside that same restaurant, someone who had been watching, someone who remembered, was about to make sure the world didn't forget. The night air felt colder once the door closed behind them, not because the temperature had dropped, but because silence has a way of making everything heavier when dignity is all you have left. Caleb kept walking, his boots steady against the damp sidewalk, each step measured, each breath controlled, like a man who had learned that falling apart never solved anything. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Mia's voice was soft, careful, like she was afraid the wrong question might break something fragile inside him. Caleb shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart. We are just changing plans." 3 simple words, calm and even, but they carried more weight than she could understand. They passed a row of glowing storefronts, reflections of warm lights sliding across glass windows filled with things they could not afford, things Caleb did not even bother to look at anymore. He had learned to see through them, the same way people had learned to see through him. A bus rumbled past, its headlights washing over them for a moment before disappearing down the street, leaving behind a quiet that pressed in closer. Mia tugged lightly on his hand. "Can we still have dinner?" He glanced down at her, her small face hopeful in the dim light, and for a second, just a second, something inside his chest tightened. "Yeah," he said softly. "We will figure it out." They stopped near a vending machine outside a closed convenience store, its fluorescent light flickering faintly above them. Caleb reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against a few crumpled bills and loose coins, the last of what he had. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Not enough for anything more than something small. Something temporary. Something that would not last. Mia watched him, not asking, just waiting. Always waiting. He crouched down to her level, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "How about we split something for now, and tomorrow we get something better?" She nodded quickly, too quickly, as if agreeing fast enough might make it true. "Okay." He fed the machine, the coins clinking one by one, each sound echoing louder than it should have in the quiet street. The machine buzzed, hesitated, then dropped a single wrapped sandwich behind the glass. Caleb retrieved it and handed it to her first. "You go ahead." She shook her head. "We share." 3 words. Gentle. Firm. He paused, then nodded once. "We share." They sat on the cold curb, the city humming softly around them, distant traffic blending into the night like a lullaby that no one really listened to anymore. Mia took a small bite, then handed it back. Caleb did the same, slow and measured, making it last longer than it should have. The streetlight above them flickered, casting brief shadows that stretched and disappeared, like moments trying not to be forgotten. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet was not empty. It was full of things unsaid, full of strength that did not need to announce itself, full of a kind of love that did not need proof. Caleb leaned back slightly, looking up at the dark sky, his jaw tightening just enough to hold everything in place. He had lost the job, lost the last bit of stability he had been holding on to. And tonight, he had lost something else too, something invisible but real. But still, he had not lost himself. And somewhere, not far from where they sat, someone else had seen that clearly. Someone who had not forgotten the man who chose kindness when he had every reason not to. And that memory was already moving toward him, quietly, steadily, like something the night itself was about to deliver. The wind picked up slightly as the night stretched on, carrying with it the faint hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves along the empty street. And Caleb Dawson sat there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he did not want to move, but because sometimes stillness is the only place a man can gather what remains of himself. Mia leaned gently against his arm, her small frame warm against the cool air, her breathing slow and steady as if she trusted that wherever they were, it was enough because he was there. Caleb looked down at her, his expression softening just for a second before he lifted his gaze back toward the quiet road ahead. "Ready to head back?" he asked quietly. She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Can we go to the car?" He gave a small smile. "Yeah, we can go to the car." 3 words. Simple. Certain. They stood, and Caleb brushed off his jeans before taking her hand again, their footsteps echoing lightly as they made their way down the block toward the old sedan parked beneath a flickering streetlight, its paint worn, its presence unnoticed by most. But to them, it was shelter, it was space, it was what they had. As they approached, Caleb reached into his pocket for the keys, but his movement slowed when he noticed something across the street, a faint memory pulling at the edge of his thoughts, something from earlier that day that refused to stay buried. It had started just hours before the restaurant, before the cold curb, before the quiet hunger. He had been walking past a side street, his mind focused on finding any kind of work, any opportunity that might carry them through another week, when he saw her. She had been standing near the curb beside a black car, one hand resting against the door, her posture composed but slightly unsteady, like someone trying not to show that something was wrong. He almost kept walking. Almost. Life had taught him that most people did not want help, especially not from someone who looked like him. But then she took a step, just one, and paused, her balance shifting just enough to make it clear that something was not right. Caleb stopped. "Ma'am, are you okay?" His voice had been calm, respectful, careful not to intrude. She looked at him, her expression guarded at first, then something softer, something honest. "I am fine," she had said, but her voice did not fully agree. Caleb glanced around, then back at her. "You do not look fine." 3 words. Not pushy, just true. She hesitated, then exhaled quietly, like she had been holding more than just her breath. "Just a little dizzy," she admitted. He nodded once. "Sit down for a minute." He gestured toward the curb, stepping back to give her space, not assuming, not forcing. She studied him for a second, as if measuring something she could not quite name, then slowly sat. The city noise moved around them, cars passing, people walking by without stopping, without noticing. Caleb crouched a few feet away, not too close, just enough to be there. "Do you need water?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "I will be okay." He did not leave. Not right away. Something in him would not let him. After a moment, he reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a small bottle of water he had been saving, the last one he had. He held it out. "Take it anyway." She looked at it, then at him. "You should keep that." He gave a faint shrug. "I will be fine." 3 words again. Quiet. Steady. The kind that asks for nothing in return. She accepted it slowly, her fingers brushing his for just a second, and in that brief moment, something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but something real. Something that would not be forgotten. And now, standing beside his car hours later, Caleb exhaled slowly, the memory settling into place as he opened the passenger door for Mia. Because what he had walked away from without a second thought, without a name, without expectation, was already finding its way back to him, and he did not know it yet, but the night was far from over. The car door creaked softly as Caleb opened it, the worn hinges giving a quiet protest before settling into stillness, and Mia climbed in without a word, curling into the passenger seat with the kind of trust only a child could carry, the kind that did not question where tomorrow would come from as long as her father was still there. Caleb closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side, each step slow, deliberate, like he was pacing not just his movement, but his thoughts. He slid into the seat, the familiar scent of old fabric and faint motor oil wrapping around him like something both comforting and unforgiving at the same time. For a moment, he did not start the engine. He just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, the dashboard light casting a soft glow across his face. Mia shifted beside him. "Are we sleeping here tonight?" she asked, her voice quiet but not afraid. Caleb nodded once. "Just for tonight." 3 words. Steady. Reassuring. He turned the key, and the engine came to life with a low hum, not loud, not proud, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to keep going. He adjusted the heater, letting a thin stream of warm air push back against the cold that had settled into the car, and reached into the back seat, pulling forward a folded blanket that had seen better days. He handed it to her. "Here you go." She wrapped it around herself, her small shoulders relaxing almost instantly. "Thank you, Daddy." He gave a faint smile. Always. Outside, the street remained quiet, the occasional car passing by like a reminder that the world was still moving, still spinning, even if their place in it felt uncertain. Caleb leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting for a second, just long enough for the weight of the day to press in again. The lost job, the empty pockets, the look on Mia's face when she said she was not hungry. And yet, beneath all of that, something else lingered. Not regret, not doubt, just the quiet certainty that he had done the right thing earlier, even if it had cost him. He exhaled slowly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening just a little. "You did good," he murmured under his breath, not loud enough for Mia to hear, not needing anyone else to agree. The heater hummed softly, the windows beginning to fog at the edges as warmth met the cold glass, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like shelter. Almost. Mia leaned her head against the seat, her eyes growing heavy. "Daddy," she said again, softer this time. "Yeah." He turned slightly toward her. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I like when we share." He nodded, his throat tightening just enough to remind him how close things really were. "Me too." 2 words. Honest. Real. She closed her eyes, drifting into sleep with the kind of peace that only comes from feeling safe, even when everything else says you are not. Caleb watched her for a moment longer, making sure she was settled, then leaned his head back against the seat, staring up through the windshield at the dim outline of the night sky above the city. Time passed quietly. Minutes, maybe more. The kind that do not announce themselves. And then, somewhere in the distance, a pair of headlights turned slowly onto their street. Caleb did not notice at first. He was too deep in his thoughts, too used to being overlooked by the world around him. But the car did not pass. It slowed. Then it stopped, not far from where they were parked. The engine idled low, steady, controlled. Caleb's eyes shifted slightly, catching the reflection in his side mirror. A dark vehicle. Clean. Out of place on a street like this. The door opened. A figure stepped out, heels touching pavement with a quiet, deliberate rhythm that cut through the silence like something intentional, something certain. And for the first time that night, something in the air changed. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to make the quiet feel different. Because the past he had walked away from earlier that day had just found him again, and this time, it was not going to stay unnoticed. The sound of heels against pavement carried through the quiet street, slow and deliberate, each step measured with a kind of confidence that did not need to be announced, and Caleb Dawson's eyes remained fixed on the side mirror, watching the reflection draw closer without fully turning his head, because men like him learned early that attention was not always something you could afford to invite. The figure stopped a few feet behind his car, the soft glow of the streetlight outlining a silhouette that felt familiar in a way his mind had not yet fully caught up to. Caleb exhaled quietly, then reached forward and lowered the engine to idle, his movements calm, controlled, never rushed. Mia stirred slightly beside him but did not wake, her breathing still steady beneath the thin blanket. "Stay asleep," he murmured under his breath, more instinct than instruction. The car door opened with a soft click as Caleb stepped out, closing it gently behind him so as not to disturb her, and the night air met him again, cool and still, carrying that same subtle shift that had been building since the headlights appeared. He turned slowly, not defensive, not confrontational, just aware. The woman stood there now, closer than before, her posture composed, her presence unmistakably out of place against the worn edges of the street. For a second, neither of them spoke. The city seemed to hold its breath around them, the distant hum of traffic fading into something softer, something waiting. "You left before I could thank you." Her voice broke the silence, calm, clear, and steady, the same voice he had heard earlier, now without hesitation. Caleb blinked once, recognition settling in as memory caught up with reality. "You are feeling better," he replied simply, his tone even, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging what was in front of him. 3 words. Grounded. She stepped slightly closer, the faint sound of her shoes against the pavement echoing softly. "Because of you." Caleb shook his head once. "You would have been fine." He did not step forward. He did not step back. He stayed exactly where he was. She studied him for a moment, her gaze sharper now, as if she was looking beyond the surface, measuring something deeper than the situation itself. "You gave me your water," she said. "You stayed when no one else did." Caleb's expression did not change. It was nothing. 3 words again. Quiet. Dismissive of anything that might turn into obligation. She let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both disbelief and understanding at the same time. It was not nothing. Her voice softened, not weaker, just more certain. "Not to me." The silence returned, but it felt different now, heavier in meaning, lighter in tension. Caleb glanced briefly toward his car, toward the faint outline of Mia resting inside, then back at the woman. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his tone respectful, direct, not inviting more than necessary. She followed his glance, noticing the child, the blanket, the quiet reality sitting just a few feet away. Something in her expression shifted. Subtle but undeniable. "I was looking for you," she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. "You found me." 2 words. Simple. She nodded once. "I had help." Caleb did not ask who. He did not ask why. He simply stood there, waiting, giving her the space to say what she came to say or to leave if that was her choice. The wind moved lightly between them, carrying a quiet tension that was no longer uncomfortable, just unfinished. She took one more step forward, her voice lowering just enough to carry intention. "You walked away without asking my name." Caleb's response came without hesitation. "You did not need it." 3 words. Final. She held his gaze for a second longer. Then something in her expression softened into something almost like respect, something earned, not given. And in that moment, standing in the quiet street with nothing but his daughter asleep behind him and the weight of everything he had lost still fresh in his chest, Caleb Dawson did not realize that the woman in front of him had already decided that this would not be the end of their story, but the beginning of something that would change everything he thought he understood about loss, about dignity, and about what happens when kindness refuses to stay unnoticed. The silence between them lingered just long enough to feel intentional, not awkward, but weighted with something unspoken, something that neither of them rushed to break, and Caleb Dawson remained still, his posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly who you were even when the world had stripped everything else away. The woman studied him for another moment, her eyes tracing not just his face, but the details most people overlooked, the worn edges of his jacket, the quiet steadiness in his stance, the absence of any expectation in the way he stood there. "Most people would have asked for something," she said finally, her voice softer now, more curious than guarded. Caleb gave a slight shrug. "Most people are not me." 3 words. Not proud, not defensive, just true. She let out a faint breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though it did not fully form. No, they are not. The streetlight flickered once above them, casting a brief shadow across the pavement before settling again, and somewhere in the distance, a car passed without slowing, without noticing, as if the moment unfolding here existed outside the rest of the world. She took another small step forward, closing the space between them just enough to shift the air. "My name is Naomi Clark," she said, her tone even, deliberate, as if the name itself carried weight she was used to people recognizing. Caleb nodded once. Caleb Dawson. 2 names. Equal. No hesitation. No reaction beyond acknowledgement. Naomi watched him closely, waiting, perhaps expecting some change in expression, some flicker of recognition, but it never came. Instead, he simply stood there, the same as before, unaffected by the name, untouched by whatever it might mean elsewhere. "You do not know who I am," she said, not as a question, but as a realization. Caleb shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am." 3 words. Respectful. Unmoved. Naomi's gaze softened, not with disappointment, but with something closer to understanding. "That might be the first honest thing I have heard all day." She glanced briefly toward the car again, her eyes settling on the faint outline of Mia sleeping inside, the blanket rising and falling gently with each breath. "She is your daughter," Naomi said quietly. Caleb followed her gaze for a second, then nodded. "Everything I have." 3 words. This time, they carried something deeper, something that did not need explanation. Naomi's expression shifted again, something more human now, less distant, less composed. "You were going to spend your last money on food for her," she said, connecting the pieces out loud, her voice almost thoughtful. Caleb did not answer right away. He did not need to. The truth was already there. Instead, he simply said, "We managed." 2 words. Enough. Naomi looked back at him, her posture straightening slightly, the confidence returning, but now it carried a different tone, less about control, more about decision. "I would like to help you," she said, direct, clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Caleb's response came just as steady. "You do not have to." 4 words. Not rejecting, not inviting, just setting a boundary. Naomi tilted her head slightly, studying him again, as if reassessing the man in front of her for the 3rd time that night. "I know I do not have to," she replied. "I want to." The air between them shifted again, not tense, but charged with intention, with something that was no longer just about a favor returned, but about something deeper taking shape. Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting once more toward his daughter, then back to Naomi. "People usually want something back," he said, his voice calm, measured, not accusing, just stating what experience had taught him. Naomi held his gaze without flinching. "Not this time." 3 words. Certain. Uncompromising. The quiet returned again, but now it carried a different weight, the kind that comes just before something changes. And for the first time since the night had begun, Caleb Dawson felt it. Not as hope, not yet, but as something close, something approaching, something that did not ask for permission to arrive. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, the quiet certainty in her eyes unmoving. And then she did something Caleb did not expect. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, simple business card, not flashy, not exaggerated, just clean, precise, intentional. She stepped forward and held it out to him. "Take this," she said. Caleb looked at the card, then back at her, his expression unchanged, measuring not the object but the meaning behind it. "What is it?" he asked calmly. Naomi did not lower her hand. "A door," she replied. 2 words. Direct. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then accepted it, his fingers brushing the edge of the card without urgency, without assumption. He glanced down briefly. Naomi Clark. The name sat there in plain print, followed by a title that carried weight far beyond the quiet street they were standing on. Chief Executive Officer. Clark Industries. Caleb's eyes lingered for just a second longer this time, not in shock, not in awe, but in recognition of something larger than the moment. He looked back up at her. "That explains the car," he said quietly. Naomi gave a faint, almost amused breath. "That explains very little." The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as the distance between who she was and where they stood became clear, not as a divide, but as a contrast. Caleb slid the card into his pocket without another glance. I am not looking for favors, he said, his tone steady, not defensive, just honest. Naomi nodded once. I know. 3 words. Certain. She took a small step back, giving him space again, respecting the boundary he had set without needing to challenge it. But you are looking for a chance, she added, her voice softer now, less about power, more about truth. Caleb did not answer right away. His eyes moved briefly toward the car, toward Mia, then back to Naomi. Everyone is, he said finally. 2 words. Real. Naomi's expression settled into something resolute, something decided. Then let me be clear, she said, her voice steady, each word placed with intention. This is not charity. She paused just long enough for the weight of that statement to land. It is an opportunity. Caleb studied her, not skeptical, not convinced, just present. Opportunity for what? He asked. Naomi's answer came without hesitation. To work. 1 word. Simple. Clean. The kind that did not need decoration. Caleb's brow shifted slightly, not in doubt, but in consideration. Doing what? Naomi allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, not condescending, not playful, just knowing. Something you are more qualified for than you think. Caleb exhaled quietly, the night air steady around them, his mind moving through possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider in a long time. You do not know me, he said. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. I know enough. 3 words. Firm. She glanced once more toward the car, toward the sleeping child who had become the center of everything Caleb was still holding together. And I know what kind of man gives away his last bottle of water without asking who he is helping. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, full of something that did not need to be proven. Caleb's grip tightened slightly in his pocket where the card now rested, not out of fear, but out of awareness that something real was being placed in his hands. Naomi turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, then paused. Come to this address tomorrow, she said, her voice calm, certain. 9 in the morning. She looked back at him one last time. Do not be late. 3 words. Not a command. A standard. Caleb nodded once, slow, deliberate. I will be there. 4 words. No hesitation. Naomi studied him for a brief second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of her own, as if something had just been confirmed. She turned and walked back toward the waiting car, her steps steady, her presence no less composed than when she arrived, but now carrying something else with it, something quieter, something resolved. The door closed. The engine started, and within seconds, the car disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the soft hum of the street and a man standing beside his car, holding on to a single moment that had just shifted the direction of everything without making a sound. The night settled back into stillness after the car disappeared, the faint echo of its engine fading into the distance until it became just another forgotten sound in a city that rarely paused for anything. And Caleb Dawson stood there for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against the side of his car, his mind not racing, not overwhelmed, just quietly turning over what had just happened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the card again, the edges catching the soft glow of the streetlight as he looked at it more carefully this time, not with disbelief, but with a kind of grounded curiosity. Clark Industries. The name meant something, even to someone who had spent most of his time outside the circles where names like that mattered. He had seen it on buildings, on trucks, on the kind of places people worked when life had given them more than just survival. He turned the card once in his fingers, then slipped it back into his pocket, not holding onto it tightly, not treating it like a lifeline, just carrying it like a possibility. He opened the car door and slid back into the driver's seat, closing it quietly behind him, the familiar hum of the heater filling the small space again. Mia shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open just enough to find him. Daddy? Her voice was soft, still half asleep. Caleb turned toward her, his expression gentle. I am here. 3 words. Steady. She blinked slowly. Who was that? He paused for a second, considering how much to say, how much she needed to know. Someone I helped earlier, he replied simply. Mia's eyes softened, a small smile forming as she settled back into the blanket. That is good, she murmured. Helping people is good. Caleb nodded once, even though she had already closed her eyes again. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. The car grew still again, the quiet wrapping around them like something familiar, something they had learned to live within. Caleb leaned back, his eyes drifting to the windshield, to the faint outline of the sky above the city lights. And for the first time that night, something inside him shifted. Not hope, not yet, but something close enough to feel. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional passing car and the soft rhythm of Mia's breathing beside him, until the darkness began to thin at the edges, the first hint of morning pressing gently against the horizon. Caleb sat up slightly, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the coming day settling into place. 9 in the morning. He glanced at the dashboard clock, calculating the time, the distance, the small window. He had to make something out of what had been offered. He reached into the back seat and pulled forward a small bag, worn and simple, the few things he still carried from one place to another. He opened it and checked inside, making sure everything was there, everything he would need to at least show up with some sense of readiness. No suit, no polished shoes, just clean enough, honest enough. He looked over at Mia, still asleep, her face peaceful despite everything, and something in his chest tightened again, not with fear, but with purpose. "We are going somewhere today," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Outside, the light grew a little stronger, the streets slowly waking up, the world beginning again without knowing that for one man and one little girl. This morning might carry something more than just another day. Caleb started the engine again, the low hum steady, familiar, and pulled the car away from the curb, not fast, not rushed, just moving forward, because that was what he had always done. And now, for the first time in a long time, forward might actually lead somewhere different. The morning light stretched across the glass towers of downtown as Caleb Dawson pulled his car into a parking space that felt too clean, too polished for a man like him. The reflection of his worn sedan, sitting quietly between vehicles that looked like they belonged to a different world entirely. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, not hesitating, just taking one steady breath before stepping into whatever came next. Mia stirred beside him, blinking awake as the sunlight filtered through the windshield. "Where are we?" she asked softly, her voice still wrapped in sleep. Caleb glanced at her, a faint smile touching his face. "Somewhere new," he said. 3 words. Calm. Certain. He stepped out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door and offering his hand, and she took it without question, stepping onto the pavement and looking up at the tall building in front of them with quiet curiosity. The glass doors reflected them both, a man in simple clothes and a little girl wrapped in a borrowed blanket, standing at the edge of something they did not yet understand. Inside, the lobby was wide and bright, polished floors stretching beneath soft overhead lighting, the quiet hum of early morning movement already in motion. A receptionist looked up as they entered, her expression shifting briefly with surprise before settling into something more composed. "Can I help you?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. "I am here to see Naomi Clark." 4 words. Direct. The receptionist paused for a fraction of a second, then reached for her phone. "Please wait." Caleb did not move. He did not fidget. He simply stood there, Mia's hand in his, the same quiet presence he had carried through everything else now standing in the middle of a place that was not built for people like him. Seconds passed. Then footsteps approached from across the lobby, quick, precise, unmistakable. Naomi Clark appeared from behind a set of glass doors, her posture composed, her expression focused, and when her eyes landed on Caleb, something in her gaze shifted, not surprise, not doubt, but confirmation. "You came," she said. Caleb gave a small nod. "I said I would." 4 words. Steady. Naomi stepped closer, her attention briefly moving to Mia before returning to Caleb. "Good," she replied softly. She turned slightly toward the receptionist. "Clear my schedule." 3 words. Immediate. The tone changed. The room adjusted. Subtle, but undeniable. People nearby slowed. Conversations softened. The air shifted. Naomi faced Caleb again. "Walk with me." 2 words. Calm. Certain. They moved through the lobby together, the sound of their footsteps echoing lightly across the floor, and for the first time, the space that had felt distant began to close around them, not as something overwhelming, but as something opening. Inside her office, the city stretched out beyond the glass walls, the skyline wide and endless, and Naomi gestured toward a chair. Caleb remained standing for a second, then sat, not uncertain, not intimidated, just present. Mia stayed close beside him, her small hand still wrapped around his. Naomi stood across from them, her voice steady, clear. "I am offering you a position," she said. "You will start today." Caleb looked at her, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just listening. "Why?" he asked. "One word. Honest." Naomi did not hesitate. "Because you did not ask who I was." She stepped closer, her gaze firm. "And you still helped me." The room fell quiet, not empty, but full of something that did not need to be explained. Caleb nodded once, slowly, his hand tightening gently around Mia's. "I did what was right," he said. "For words. Simple." Naomi held his gaze, then gave a small nod, something like respect settling into place. "Exactly," she said. And in that moment, the distance between them disappeared, not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of something quieter, something stronger, something that no one in the room needed to say out loud. The receptionist outside stopped typing. A man walking past the glass slowed his steps. Even the quiet hum of the building seemed to soften. Because what stood in that office was not just a job being offered, not just a life being changed, but a man who had nothing left but his daughter and still chose dignity. And now, without raising his voice, without asking for anything, he had become someone the world could no longer ignore. And for a brief moment, everything around him did exactly what it had promised to do. It went completely still.